Welcome everyone here in person and on Zoom. It gives me great pleasure to introduce my colleague, Dr. Aliyah Khan. I just want to say a few things about today's presentation. One is, of course, we are the Center of Middle Eastern Studies, but this presentation is on the Caribbean. But the connection, of course, as we noted from last week, the sort of the maybe globalization of religious experience or religious dissemination, the idea that last week we had the discussion about these Muslim televangelists that are Egypt-based, but are actually speaking to many other audiences in the Arabic-speaking world and maybe beyond, but also who were watching and drawing on Christian televangelists, and they were also paying attention to some of these Protestant Arabic-speaking and some of the Coptic stations that I could also watch and so on. So things are moving, and as Dr. Khan noted in her first book, and also here to some extent, that the perception of Islam and the experience of Islam in the Caribbean has been responding to the Middle East, to Saudi, to Egypt, to Libya, and so on. And so we're talking about, in some ways, the Middle East or North Africa kind of radiating its experience of modernity, of Islam, and so on. And we see that local Islam, as the Caribbean Islam, is still having its stay. As you can see that these poems, these Qasidas are authentic, really, to the Caribbean, and so on. So it's wonderful to see this back and forth happening, which is very much part of the experience of what the modern world is, in that there are really idea flows, migrant flows, and of course the colonialism is at the heart of all that. I'm also very glad. Well, I'm not like V.S. Naipaul, so I love that point. Your English professor and you. So Dr. Aliyah Khan, our guest speaker today, is the Director of Global Islamic Studies and Associate Professor of English and Afro-American and African Studies at the University of Michigan here. She specializes in Islam and the Caribbean and the Americas. Dr. Khan has also presented and taught widely on Muslims in comics and graphic novels. Her award-winning book, Far from Mecca, Globalizing the Muslim Caribbean, from Rutgers University Press and the University of West Indies Press, is the first monograph on the comparative literature, history, and music of enslaved African Muslims and indentured Indian Muslims and their descendants in Guyana, Trinidad, and Jamaica. Dr. Khan's academic work, creative nonfiction, which we will talk about, and interviews have appeared in many journals, anthologies, and media venues, including I Will Not Go, Translations, Transformations, and Chutney, Fractals, Kaya Press, Guernica Magazine, Caribbean Quarterly, Caribbean Review of Gender Studies, Journal of West Indian Literature, National Public Radio, Times of India, Washington Post, and Sky TV in the UK, and many more to come. So please welcome Dr. Aliyah Khan.
Thanks, Khaled. I appreciate the vote of confidence on many more to come. So thank you, Khaled, and thank you, Warsan, for arranging this talk, and thanks all of you for being here in person and also on Zoom. For the CMENIS Colloquium students who've read the piece that I'll be talking about today, what I'll present today is an abridged version of the article you read, as well as some of my other comments on the autoethnographic work that I've done here, with the help of some audio and images of objects and events I used for research, but of course I couldn't include in the published articles. So you get to see my objects. What you read was just published
in Turkey
here. Yeah. And I brought for show and tell here.
Yeah,
This is, so what you read was just published in the proceedings of the conference at which I first presented it, which was in September 2023 at the first collaborative symposium on Islam in the Caribbean that was held with the government of Guyana and the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, the OIC, which is headquartered in Jeddah, though its research arm, IRSICA, the Research Center for Islamic History, Art, and Culture, is headquartered in Istanbul. The OIC is essentially the United Nations for Muslim countries. Guyana and Suriname are the only two OIC member countries in the Western Hemisphere. The surprising non-member of the OIC is not the United States, it's Trinidad, which proportionately has as many Muslims as and shares a culture with Guyana. I'll begin with a field and positionality preamble, since this work is in part autoethnography. In the culturally hybrid and creolized New World space of the Caribbean, thinking race and religion intersectionally reflects how practitioners on the ground define themselves anti-colonially. An example is the growing numbers of Afro-Caribbean people reverting to Islam because they believe that this is a liberatory political reversion to a West African ancestral faith lost to enslavement, in addition to the usual Islamic rationale of conversion or reversion to the inborn human state of fitra or purity. In the Anglophone Caribbean, every diasporic religion and spiritual practice is simultaneously associated with its ethnic group of origin, as well as being a side practice for someone else, whether they're willing to admit it publicly or not. Historically speaking, it's colonial governments who have had the biggest issue with syncretic or parallel religious practices. As Trinidadian writer Kevin Jared Hussein says, as you can see in the slide, to live in the modern Caribbean, seen here in this map, is to occupy duality. Here, we exist in tenets both conservative and liberal. Today, your soul explodes on the pews in psalms and canticles. Tomorrow, it does so with fete klaxons and gyrating waists. And it does so acceptably without cries of hypocrisy or duality. What's interesting for us is that Hussein's paradigm for living modern Caribbean hybridity is religion, which is not usually the paradigm for living hybridity, at least outside of the Caribbean. As per the title that implicates fermented beings in Buddhism and Hinduism, his new novel, Hungry Ghosts, which is great, he's an up-and-coming new writer, explores religion, specifically Hindu and Christian post-indentureship tensions in Trinidad. My 2020 book, Far from Mecca, Globalizing the Muslim Caribbean, is on the comparative history, literature, and music of enslaved African and indentured Indian Muslims and their descendants in Guyana, Trinidad, and Jamaica. What you'll hear about today is a continuation of sorts of that book. Essentially, it's a musical thread that I left to pull later. The research was funded by the Center for World Performance Studies here, as well as the Center for Islam in the Contemporary World at Shenandoah University in Virginia. You know, it's how you wish a book could have everything in it, but then it can't. So you have to catch up later. In my own 1980s childhood masjid in Georgetown, Guyana, we all knew who the upstanding Indian Muslim aunties were, who were also dabbling in African diasporic obeah or herbalism, and possibly talking to Islamic jinn on the side. The masjid community whispered about this, but they did not object. It's different now with influence from global Islamic revivalist movements, global influence. But in any case, this is my cultural studies locus of enunciation for this talk. I speak about my own Muslim and Caribbean communities at home and in diaspora. But the methodology is not just autoethnography, it's also archival, literary, and musical research informed by my own positionality, which is typical of how I write both academic nonfiction and creative nonfiction. This work and my book are part of my and every other Indo-Caribbean writer and artist's attempt to reconcile subcontinental post-indenture Indian heritage with colonial and post-colonial plantation violence, as well as with African-inflected Caribbean identity formation. But I'm not always or usually a proponent of that nostalgic strain of Caribbean studies that holds trauma and loss as the frameworks for understanding and recovering Indian and African labor diaspora history in the Americas. Nor do I think, like V.S. Naipaul, whom Khaled just mentioned, that the Caribbean is a hopeless cause, doomed to perpetual colonial mimicry a la Homi Bhabha. Trauma or mimicry as a lens through which to examine creolization are probably the most common paradigms in Caribbean studies. But in the current geopolitical moment of exhaustion and despair, I don't think I find enough effective hope in the Caribbean trauma paradigm's insistent ongoing pathologizing of the diaspora psyche. I prefer feminist critic Anjali Arondekar's formulation following post-negritude Caribbean thinkers like M. Jackie Alexander of remembering with the possibility of reunion and embracing the radical, non-recuperative abundance offered by an incomplete colonial archive. That, as Arondekar says, embraces presence without return or without fear of loss and does not prescribe value. Caribbean and African diaspora studies offers Islamic studies decolonial archival practices like Saidiya Hartman's critical fabulation and What I Think About, models of hybridity and creolization, in which unfixed notions of race are central, not peripheral to analysis. Though I would like to say that I don't do critical fabulation. My creative nonfiction and my academic writing are separate. I can't combine them in my head. To borrow a word from Yahya Burt, Islamic studies contributes an ummatic understanding of transnationalism to Caribbean studies. So that's my Islamic Caribbean Manifesto preamble. So on to the Caribbean Qasida. In this work, I explore the songbook and Muslim album dissemination and transliterated creolization of pre-partition 19th century Indian Qasida poetic phrase songs that were brought to the Caribbean by Urdu-speaking indentured Indian Muslims. This happens in the context of historical and contemporary struggles over Urdu linguistic retention and transnational Islamic debates over the permissibility of music at all, religious authenticity, and sectarian authority. I focus on the material Indo-Caribbean Qasida songbook and its subcontinental antecedents, including a popular Indo-Muslim text called Milad-e-Akbar, showing that the Indo-Caribbean Qasida is a devotional type of song that propagates Indian Islam and preserves Urdu through performances of religious authenticity. Language is a crucial part of creolization debates in the Caribbean. Creolization, of course, being this kind of catch-all term for the many cultural encounters, crashes, hybridizations, and meldings during and after transatlantic enslavement. I argue that the Qasida is simultaneously conserved and creolized in transliteration and translation, becoming a religious art form that is accessible to Afro-Caribbean people and to Indian Hindus as part of nation-building Caribbean projects. Muslims are 6 to 10% of the Indo-Caribbean, with Hindus comprising the vast majority of the 500,000 Indian subcontinentals who came from British India and were brought to the Caribbean as indentured bound coolies to work on English, French, and Dutch Caribbean plantations from 1838 to 1917, following the 1833 Slavery Abolition Act in the British West Indies. People of Indian descent today are 40% of Guyana and Trinidad, which is always strange for people showing up in these countries and being very confused about why there's Indian people here. They're also a third of Suriname and the same proportion of their diasporas in North America, England, and the Netherlands. Most Anglophone Caribbean Muslims are of Indian descent with a heritage language of Urdu rather than the usual Bhojpuri or Hindi. But since 1960s independence from England, there have been a growing number of politicized Afro-Caribbean people who view reversion to Islam, as I've mentioned, as a reclamation of enslaved West African Muslim heritage, or as a Pan-African revolutionary act in the tradition of Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam. So my work focuses on the Anglophone Caribbean, usually Guyana, Trinidad, and Jamaica, which have Afro-Caribbean majorities, but large Indo-Caribbean minorities. Briefly on poetic form, and I feel like I should let Khaled give this part of the talk. The Qasida Islamic devotional song form began as a pre-Islamic Arab poetic ode form that became an Islamic one. The most famous Islamic Qasida is the second mantle ode, mantle meaning cloak, cloak of the Prophet Muhammad, or the Qasida al-Burda, composed by the 7th Islamic century and 13th century Common Era poet of Mamluk Egypt, al-Busiri. My favorite Islamic mantle ode, though, is the original classical Qasida from the time of the Prophet and the birth of Islam by Ka'ab ibn Zuhair, with the excellent title of, especially if you have friends named Suad, Banat Suad, Suad has departed. Major subcategories of Qasidas include Nats, which are supplicatory praise odes to the Prophet Muhammad, and they're also panegyrics to a patron. The classical Arabic Qasida structure is tripartite, and it's much more complicated than that, like generally tripartite, consisting of a lyriac elegiac prelude called a nasib, followed by the rahil, which is a journey that's often a desert crossing, and lastly by the madih, or the encomium praising the patron or subject. As Suzanne Stetkevich says, although there was praise poetry addressed to the Prophet in his lifetime, the distinct poetic genre did not crystallize on the post-classical period, spreading after the 1250s to the rest of the Muslim world. It's also important in sectarian terms to point out that the theme of praise of the Prophet was developed within the context of Shia praise poetry or elegy for the Ahlul Bayt, the family of the Prophet. In the Persianate Indian Muslim tradition, when Urdu Shairi verse poetry is set to a melody, it then becomes a sung Qasida. What's called Qasidas in India, Pakistan, and the Indo-Caribbean diaspora now are essentially highly condensed praise songs to the Prophet Muhammad, or on occasion to God. On August 28th, 1914, to skip all the way from classical from classical Arabia to the contemporary Caribbean, on August 28th, 1914, the Port of Spain Gazette of colonial Trinidad and Tobago reported breathlessly on the wartime shipboard arrival from New York of 2 men of the recording laboratory of the Victor Talking Machine Company, who are making a special trip to Trinidad for the purpose of recording a complete repertoire of Trinidadian music, including East Indian selections by local talent. So what we learned from this is that the first recordings of Indian music in the Caribbean in 1914 were religious and Muslim. Recorded on September 9, 1914 by performers S.M. Akbar Ali and Ghulam Hussain, and titled Maulud Sharif's numbers 1 through 7, the songs were classified in the American Victor Talking Machine ledgers under, quote, East Indian chant, Mohammedan, marketing genre, West Indian Trinidad, and language Urdu. Maulud or Maulid or Milad means birth, meaning birth of the Prophet Muhammad, and Sharif means exalted. So Maulud Sharif is exalted birth, namely of the Prophet. The National Carnival Commission of Trinidad and Tobago notes that little is known of these 1914 performers, except that they were of East Indian descent and recorded sacred Mohammedan chants. Their language, not mine. The recordings reached the stage of having masters made, but the songs were never released and unfortunately are not extant in the Victor archives. I have named. They were the first recordings done of East Indian music in Trinidad and Tobago, and likely in the entire Indo-Caribbean. These Maulud Sharif songs Akbar Ali and Hussain sang in 1914 Trinidad were likely Qasidas, these same devotional praise songs that people sing in Muslim Indian colonial labor diasporas from Mauritius to Guyana. So not just the Caribbean, but all throughout the Indian labor diasporas of the 19th century. The Victor masters of these original 1914 songs may be lost, but many of such songs endure in transliterated Urdu with English translations, with the Islam practiced by Caribbean people. Indo-Caribbean Muslims are mostly by ancestral legacy Sunnis of the Hanafi madhab, meaning the school of jurisprudential reasoning, who brought Sufi-influenced 19th century Barelvi and Deobandi Indian Muslim debates with them to the Caribbean. But as a result of early 20th century pre-partition Indian missionizing in the Caribbean and also in the United States, linked to the development of Black Islam in the United States, it is Ahmadi Muslim followers of Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, who lived between 1835 and 1908 and was from Qadian, India. It's the people from his sect, Ahmadi Muslims, not Shia, who are the visible Caribbean Muslim sectarian minority, which is a totally different state of affairs from anywhere else in the world. Both mainstream Sunni and minority Ahmadi groups perform the Indo-Muslim devotional poetic songs called Qasidas and have had their own defining Qasida songbooks, which have a lot of overlap, since the second half of the 20th century. Sunnis use versions of, as you can see here on the left, the Asja Qasidas book, which is compiled by Trinidadian Imam Hamid Rajab, and Ahmadis use on the right the Songs of Islam, which was first edited and transliterated by Muhammad Tufail in 1969. Asja is the oldest Muslim and Sunni organization in Trinidad, the Anjuman Sunatul Jamaat Association, which was founded in 1936. Across the Muslim world, Milad, again meaning birth, and its vernacular cognates, and Milad Sharif, which we learned means exalted birth, mark the celebration of the birth of the Prophet Muhammad on Rabi al-Awwal 12, which is a Sunni date, or Rabi al-Awwal 17, which is the Shia date. Qasida singing is a prominent feature of these birth of the Prophet celebrations. Though religious in orientation, Indian diasporic Milad celebrations are performative communal events conducted in temporary ritual spaces in homes or outside of the Masala prayer space of the mosque. In the early 20th century, it was common for Indo-Caribbean women to sing Qasidas both in mosques and in mixed gender religious occasions in homes. Nowadays, however, women sing mostly in mainstream Sunni-endorsed Qasida competitions and in Ahmadi masjids. So Sunni women don't sing them publicly anymore in religious gatherings, just in competitions, usually. Unlike in the Indian subcontinent, Indo-Caribbean women rarely hold single-gender Quranic or Milad functions. In the Caribbean, the Islamic ritual performance of ta'zim, which some of you might know as Ya Nabi Salam Alayka, which means, O Prophet, peace be upon you. Other events including the celebration of the Prophet's birthday, the singing of Qasidas itself, the custom of reciting the Quranic Surah Al-Fatiha over food, and the use of Urdu theologically in dua supplications, nikah marriage contracts, and also in nikah marriage contracts and ceremonies are Indo-Caribbean Muslim traditional practices associated, as mentioned, with the 19th century Sufi-influenced Barelvi revivalist movement, which centered personal devotion toward God, the prophets, and saints, and formed in reaction to the Wahhabi-linked revivalist Deobandi movement in India. Published written transliterations of Indo-Caribbean Qasidas date from at least the 1940s, when the Guyanese Sunni United Sadr Islamic Anjuman presented Qasidas in English transliteration in its journal in 1948. As seen in this ad, in the mid-20th century Caribbean, Sunnis distributed copies of the Ahmadi English Quran translation of the Quran by Maulana Muhammad Ali, as well as Ahmadi Qasida books. They were the ones doing the dissemination of these texts because both because of the wider availability of their Dawah missionizing texts, and also they were doing it to run interference and critique their alleged heresies. That distribution is before 1974, when Ahmadiyat, including both subsects of the Ahmadi movement, was declared heretical and non-Muslim apostasy by the Pakistan state. So in Pakistan right now, Ahmadis are heavily persecuted, and they're not considered to be Muslims. Islamic events and Muslim homes in Trinidad and Guyana subsequently became the sites of 1980s assassinations and bombings of Pakistani Ahmadi missionaries. So I should say that speaking of autoethnography and the role of the community scholar as more than just a native informant, I was present as a child at one of those bombings in Trinidad and involved in the aftermath of an assassination in Guyana of a missionary. So, thinking about incorporating that into scholarly work is difficult, but many of us have to deal with these kinds of traumas. In any case, since the 1970s, Qasida singing and related Indo-Muslim practices have come under globally fueled Islamic revivalist scrutiny and are identified by some Muslims in the Caribbean as bid'ah, or innovation, like their favorite word, as I'll explore later. In the Caribbean, Milads and Qasidas were important sites of Indo-Muslim religious, cultural, and Urdu linguistic preservation and community cohesion during and after indentureship. But as I've mentioned, the Indian and Pakistani Muslim influence in the Caribbean has waned significantly in the present day, with well-funded Arab dawah outreach and travel. In the Caribbean, as Raymond Chikri and others argue, intra-Sunni conflict between Indo-Iranian Islamic traditionalists and between them and reformists who look to the Arab world and the global Ummah, the Muslim community, that's the conflict, versus anything else being the issue here. It's Indian traditionalists versus people who think they should be looking to Arab revivalist movements. What's interesting is dawah diplomacy, as what's called dawah diplomacy in Guyana, Muslim outreach diplomacy, begins with Cold War non-aligned Libyan dawah diplomacy and the formation of the Guyana Global Islamic Trust, GIT, in Guyana, which is still operating. That's one of those interesting non-aligned movement, global Islam, forgotten alliances. But all Caribbean Sunni factions have, at least since the 1980s, turned their focus away from subcontinental Islamic education to educating young men instead of in India and Pakistan. They now educate young men in Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and lately Qatar and Kuwait, funded by oil money. Still, the homogenization and purification of Caribbean Islam into a Wahhabi ideal is naturally incomplete, no matter how many religious young men arrive in the Caribbean to do missionizing work. The Central Islamic Organization of Guyana and their Trinidadian and the Trinidadian ASJA, which are the main representatives of Sunni Muslims to the governments of their respective countries, have since the late 1990s hosted and co-sponsored Indian-style Milad-e-Nabi Prophet's Birthday International Qasida competitions, or festival mehfils that rotate in annual locations amongst Guyana, Trinidad, and Suriname. It's like world baseball that is like between two countries, US and Japan, or maybe Dominican Republic or something like that. But the international Qasida competitions are among Guyana, Trinidad, and Suriname. And sometimes they invite like people from India to be judges and Pakistan to be judges. So in this event, there are adult male and female, as well as junior male and female categories. Each competitor is required to render their songs in no more than 4 minutes in Urdu, and they give points based on choice of qasidas, manner of dress, pronunciation, and melody. So that a legibly Muslim appearance and proper Urdu inflection are required speak to the fact that Indian and Muslim cultural revivalists in the Caribbean argue for qasida singing and milad performativity as primary tools for the probably impossible task of reviving Urdu as a spoken language for Muslims in Guyana and Trinidad. This qasida creolization and performance by non-Indians is one iteration of the way that Indian Muslim religiosity in the Caribbean is inflected by the majority Afro-Caribbean. In Guyana, the two brothers Ishaq from a rural part, and a lot of times, or at least it used to be that a lot of Indians in Guyana only used one name, not two. From a rural part of the majority Indian county of Berbice, were long known as Black Qasida practitioners, singing in Qasida competitions in Urdu. But tellingly, said a singer whom I interviewed who performed with them, in addition to being Afro-Guyanese reverts who were, quote, good practicing Muslims, the Ishaq brothers were, quote, married to Indians too. This suggests that Qasida singing, at least in their time in the 80s and early 90s, was still contingent on some degree of ethno-religious familial relation to the Indo-Muslim Caribbean community. I was also interested to hear recently of Black Muslim Qasida singers in South Africa, another site of the Indian colonial labor diaspora. As you can see in this photo, national Qasida competitions in Guyana may be religious in content, but they are very notably endorsed by the multi-ethnic state, as represented here by the former Prime Minister. I will introduce you further to this Guyana Qasida champ, Ustad Nazim Bacchus, later. He happens to also have been my own childhood madrasa Quran teacher. Ustad is a title that's used for teacher or master of Islamic learning. Qasida singing is not the first way in which Afro-Caribbean people participated in Indo-Muslim religious practices and events. The most noteworthy historical instance of Islamic creolization in the Caribbean, at least colonially, is Hussein, the evolution of the Indian Shia Muslim processional commemoration of the martyrdoms of the Prophet Muhammad's grandsons, Hassan by poisoning and Hussein in the month of Muharram at the Battle of Karbala in 680 CE. The resulting Ashura memorialization was brought to the Caribbean by a small minority of indentured, a very small minority of indentured Shia Indians, and it evolved into a non-sectarian Muslim colonial festival called Hussein in Trinidad and Jamaica, and called Taja or Tazia in Guyana and Suriname. There is also a Hussein variant in Indo-Mauritian communities called Yamse. Hussein in the mid-19th century Caribbean was a multi-day religious celebration involving dancing, masquerades, stick fighting, and drumming, culminating in a procession of people carrying extremely large and elaborate tajas, or model tombs, into the ocean. They're still doing that. Afro-Caribbean people found its celebratory carnival aspect familiar and joined in, eventually working as paid drummers in the processions. Sometimes they were even hired to carry the model tombs. The working class Afro-Caribbean transition from Hussein partygoer to participant was even clearer in colonial British Guyana, where Afro-Guyanese started up their own quasi-religious festival called Black Taja. Between the 1860s and 1880s, Hussein in the colonial Caribbean was violently suppressed by the British and Dutch. In 1884, during what became known as the Muharram Massacre in Trinidad, colonial police fired into a crowd celebrating Hussein, killing 16 people. British were concerned that the festival was one of the few times in which Black and Indian workers, who were generally suspicious of each other's cultures, religions, and roles in the labor economy, congregated and celebrated together. What remained of Hussein in early 20th century Trinidad was subjected to uncompromising hostility directed toward the festival by Canadian Presbyterian missionaries, and then later on by Indo-Trinidadian Muslims themselves, the majority of whom were Sunnis who looked down on the festival's Shia origins. The festival persists in St. James in the capital of Trinidad, and Cedros in South Trinidad, and in limited form in Clarendon Parish in Jamaica. Trinidadian processions, including the tomb building, now involve many Hindu Indian people who are actually now the majority generational builders of the model tombs, as well as Afro-Caribbean people. One reason that many Sunni Muslims in Trinidad don't like Hussein is because they say that the practices of submerging these model tombs, which are supposed to represent the tombs of Hassan and Hussein, they say that the practices of submerging these tombs in the Gulf of Paria at the end of the procession. The Gulf of Paria is across from Venezuela. There's only 7 miles between it and Venezuela. And it's how Venezuelan migrants come over to Trinidad. So they say that submerging these tombs in the Gulf of Paria at the end of the procession is far too reminiscent of Hindu puja water rituals at the seaside. There are also further questions about the halal permissibility of the way that, if you look on the right-hand side here, right bottom, about the way that prayer can happen at tajas. And as you can see here, there are elements that look like Hindu diyas, since we just had Diwali, but Hindu diyas, oil lamps, and prasad, deity food offerings. These things, I think, there are Hindu influence. Some of the practices here, and are a result of the model tombs, as I mentioned, now being built by a majority of generational Hindu families. There are some concerted efforts during the festivals in Port of Spain, in the capital, to have it re-Muslimized. And there's like congregations of brothers who come and like sing Muslim songs and like re-Muslimize things. But anyway, in the south of Trinidad, which is rural and heavily Indo-Caribbean, it's still given a lot of Hindu and Muslim together. But I also argue that the early reason for drowning the Tajas in the sea is for Muslims in the faraway Caribbean to send the tombs of the Prophet's grandsons, Hassan and Hussein, to the mythical Islamic Karbala, of the Islamic heart, let's say. In any case, at its height in the late 19th century, Hase was a flexible arena for interracial and interreligious participation, providing a Muslim avenue for cultural exchange between the Black and Indian Caribbean. Peter Manuel, the ethnomusicologist Peter Manuel, calls the Qasida a subgenre of the local classical repertoire of Indo-Caribbean music with roots in Indian forms. He's the ethnomusicologist who's written the most about Caribbean Qasidas. And his assertion is that the Caribbean Muslim Qasida is part of efforts by Indo-Caribbean Muslims to match the performances of Indo-Caribbean Hindu bhajans, Hindu devotional songs. And so that's his argument, right? That, the Muslims saw that Hindus had these bhajans and they were like, all right, we need something, we need some songs. I disagree with him. So Manuel is mistaken that Indo-Caribbean Muslims adopted the structure or content of Qasida singing from bhajans, the Hindu religious song form with which they most share functionality as well as devotional context. The singing of Indo-Caribbean Qasidas, as I've said, is a religious practice that was brought from the subcontinent by indentured Muslim, derived from Barelvi Muslim revivalist poetry of the 18th and 19th century. The most famous Urdu and Persian language poet and composer of the genre, as you may know, was Mirza Ghalib. Indians and Pakistanis also continue to hold, Milad celebrations on household and large public celebratory scales, similar to what happens in the Caribbean on a smaller scale. So here are the receipts as to why I disagree with Peter Manuel that, this practice has roots in 19th century, 18th and 19th century India rather than be coming directly from Hinduism. Though Caribbean Muslim devotees are rarely aware of it, many widely known qasidas are derived from the devotional text Milad-e-Akbar and poems by 18th and 19th century Urdu-speaking Indian poets. These poets were well known in their day in pre-partition India and then in Pakistan, to which some migrated between 1947 independence and the establishment of the Islamic Republic of Pakistan in 1956. Milad-e-Akbar, which is undated, is arguably the most well-known of all Milad and songbooks Muslim songbooks in the subcontinent and in its diasporas. This text was a derivative product of 18th and 19th century reformist Islam's Urdu poetry. It was written and compiled by the Sufi Khwaja, meaning saint, Muhammad Akbar Warsi, who was born in pre-independence Meerut, India, and died in Karachi, Pakistan in 1953. So he didn't write all of these, he's a compiler who tweaked some stuff, added some stuff, filled some things out. Milad-e-Akbar is an extensive praise document containing multiple short songs as well, called nats, as well as qasidas. It also includes accounts of the birth of the Prophet, including his mother's pregnancy and his babyhood, sayings about him, Milad congregational etiquette rules, du'as that you could make for various purposes. It includes Quranic passages and descriptions of other Islamic events. It's a primer. It's an Islamic primer for the Indo-Indian Muslim. And by Indian, I mean pre-partition. At the end of the text, with Warsi cognizant of sectarian disagreements over Milad and music, and also through his knowledge of the use of Arabic in authorizing Islamic discourse. So at the end of this text, there's a jurisprudential section that's written in both Arabic and Urdu, described as, quote, legal opinions of the noble Arabs, fatwas from the scholars of Medina the Radiant concerning the holding of Milad ceremonies that basically argue in both Arabic and Urdu why this is a legitimately Islamic text and why it's okay to sing devotional songs. In Urdu and English transliterated form, Milad-e-Akbar, this particular text, remained popular with the descendants of Indian indentured laborers in the Caribbean, Fiji, and Mauritius into the late 20th century. There's significant evidence of it popping up in Mauritius before the advent of cassette and CD technologies, where it was conserved by imams and viewed as a primary written repository of indentured Indian Muslim cultural retention and tradition. In Indo-Caribbean Qasida songbooks, both the Qasidas and passages on proper performance deportment usually lack citations of original authors and texts. Imam Ahmed Hamid, former Director of Education and Dawah of the Central Islamic Organization of Guyana, writes that in the Indo-Caribbean, the Urdu Islamic literature written and produced prior to the 1950s did not have a bibliography. The references to books and hadith were general. For example, people would just list it's from Sahih Bukhari without giving a number. In the past, it was taken for granted that once any reference was given, the information was authentic, which means you could make things up. In the Caribbean, Urdu was a dying language, and imams in the late 19th and early 20th centuries did not have fully comprehensive theological learning. Except in Suriname, the last Caribbean generation who fully understand Urdu was that of my grandfather, who passed away earlier this year at the age of 92. So it's not a spoken language at all, no matter what people say. Asaba Mahmoud also observed of pious Muslim women's prayer performances in Egypt, replication of the ritual form of pious observance at Caribbean Maulids therefore became almost as important as the performance and praise of the Prophet himself, in order to ensure diasporic religious authenticity and continuity. Here's one example of what the interior of these Qasida books look like. The Urdu's on, you get the song in three forms. The Urdu's on the left-hand side, and then on the facing page, you will get a transliteration that tells you how it should sound in English, and then you get a translation. Identifying the origins of popular Qasidas in the Indo-Caribbean require multilingual, transnational, and temporal detective work in English, Urdu, and sometimes in Arabic. I've identified the origins of a few so far. This one here, Praise Be to Allah, is disseminated in the Caribbean in both Sunni and Ahmadi songbooks and covered by numerous recording artists. But it's originally a ghazal by Ismail Mirathi, otherwise known as Muhammad Ismail, who was born in 1844 in Uttar Pradesh and died in 1917, who was known as a master of children's poetry. As you see here, the song texts appear first in the song text. The songs appear first in the Urdu, providing a kind of authentication, even though people can't read it. But it provides authentication. Then it's in the transliterated English and then English translation. What's interesting is that nowadays the Ahmadi songbooks retain this tripartite structure, but the Sunni ones have usually dispensed entirely with the Urdu. And most of their versions just contain the English transliteration and a translation section that is usually described as a synopsis rather than a faithful translation. An initial foray into close reading this Qasida, which is on the beauty and bounty of the earth as provided by God, reveals that God, so a little bit close reading for the English graduate student, reveals that God is called Khuda rather than Allah. Allah is the Arabic Quranic word for God. Khuda, by contrast, is Farsi for Lord or God. And it's also used widely by Urdu-speaking subcontinental Muslims. And, by extension, many people who are, from India and Pakistan, just generally. The unambiguous use of Khuda in the vast majority of Qasidas tells us that these songs predate the late 20th century, when the use of the Persian epithet Khuda rather than Allah came under fire in Pakistan and in Muslim India from Wahhabi-influenced Salafis and others, or historically being a way to signify in Farsi any god, in particular the Zoroastrian Ahura Mazda, not just Allah. Of course, the irony here is Allah itself just means God too. The most obvious manifestation of the Pakistani shift away from Persian and Urdu to Arabic terms in theological performances is the switch in Pakistan in the last 20 years from the vernacular way of saying goodbye and God protect you, which is Khuda Hafiz, to the Arabized Allah Hafiz. Outside of these heritage Qasidas, Indo-Caribbean Muslims have also switched just in speaking from Khuda to Allah for similar religious reasons, and also too because they are English speaking, and in Anglophone modernity, Allah is the God of the Muslims. By contrast, in the Caribbean, Khuda is an epithet for God that that is called by many, quote, an old people word. So I'm going to play you a brief snippet of the Qasida we just looked at here. What's funny is that this iteration is by the famed Indian singers who have also been Bollywood playback singers, Chitra and Jagjit Singh, who visited Trinidad in 1981 and recorded Hindu bhajans and Muslim Qasidas. Post-colonially, this is the most well-known performance of this song now, rather than one by a local Caribbean singer. Their version does not exactly follow the written text, which illustrates how multiple versions, improv, and repetition are also features of Qasida performance. So let's see.
Monday.com, the opposite of any work plan.
इसने जहां बना तारीफ खुदा की इसने जहां कैसी जमीन बनाई क्या आसमान
So that just gives you a kind of thing on the Zoom. Okay. So I just wanted you to hear what these things sound like. They always have like a very like sweet melodious sound because these are praise songs to God and they're praise songs, they're praise songs to the prophet and they're praise songs oftentimes too to the beauty of the earth. In the sense of like, this is what God has provided for you and it's beautiful. So, you know, this kind of sweet melodious sound is very typical. And this one, pretty much everybody from the Muslim Caribbean knows it. Unlike the singers from India, when using the Qasida songbooks, Caribbean performers, again, usually sing from the transliteration in a creolized performance because they can't read Urdu. As I've mentioned, for the Ahmadis, viewing the Urdu is a legitimizing practice that provides reassurance that the text really has ancestral Muslim cultural and Islamic religious origins. In the Sunni songbooks that have done away with the Urdu, elaborate Arabic calligraphic renditions of the Shahada Islamic creed, there is no God but God and Muhammad is his messenger, usually fill that Assadian authorizing Islamic scriptural function. Singers learn melodies and their variants through oral transmission by listening to a teacher or elders. The more variant musical airs a Qasida has, says Ustad Nazim Bakas, the more blessed it is. The best, he says, have as many as 4 melody options to suit the audience's mood, which is determined by the knowledgeable community singer. As you can see here, sometimes these aging songbook transliterations aren't enough and you need your own pronunciation notes. So I took a picture of, you know, the Ustad's notes from the songbook that he uses that, you know, he's been using the same songbook since like the 60s. Just to like sing in competitions, sing at people's religious functions and so on. So let me take pictures. Okay. Caribbean and foreign travelers to and from the subcontinent and the Arab world have always exercised a great impact on Caribbean Islam, and whatever their denomination, have historically been viewed as continually replenishing true knowledge of Islam for languishing local Muslims who are far from Mecca. Subcontinental Maulanas who visited Guyana, Trinidad, and Suriname between the 1930s and the 1980s legitimized their own Indo-Muslim practices, as well as refuted Deobandi, Wahhabi, and modern Salafi reformist arguments within the bounds of Hanafi jurisprudence and their own brands of revivalism. Things have changed now. The Quran itself condemns only speech that misleads, ill speech, and inciting via the voice, not music as such, though some exegetes read the allusions to speech and vocalization as also implicitly including music. Instruments are viewed as less permissible than vocal singing, and the majority of jurists view any music that distracts from the remembrance of God, that leads to corruption or contravenes the teachings of Islamic law, as forbidden and immoral. You may know that the Persian Shafi Sunni scholar Imam Abu Hamid Muhammad al-Ghazali, otherwise known as just al-Ghazali, is the Islamic jurist most often quoted by contemporary Sunni Muslims on the permissibility of vocal and instrumental music, and the principles relevant here of sama, which means hearing, listening, or audition, auditory listening. Al-Ghazali believed that some forms of entertainment could relieve stress, weariness, and restlessness, and encourage piety in the average human being, but that the entertainment could not encourage forbidden haram acts, and that there should be no excess. So that's usually what people say, Muslims who are, okay with music, that's usually what they say. Caribbean Muslims have typical Islamic debates over the permissibility of vocal and instrumental music, though the majority are unwilling to give up their qasidas. In the subcontinent and the Indo-Caribbean, Qasida singing and Milad celebration may be deemed by its proponents mustahab, meaning recommended, especially by the Prophet. Theologically, neither compulsory, neutral, allowed, disliked, or forbidden, or more vernacularly in the Caribbean, people will say it's good bidah or good innovation. Good innovation rejects the principle that all innovation contravenes Sharia law and instead demands a distinction between bid'ah hasana and bid'ah sayya, good innovation and unlawful innovation when applied to new things that did not exist in the Prophet's time. There is at least one authenticated Bukhari hadith, number 5048, in which the Prophet was said to have praised music. In other accounts, he allowed the beating of the daf tambourine and singing by the Al-Najjar Ansar women upon his hijrah arrival to Medina in 622. The women are said to have sung Tal'al Badru Alayna, which many of you might know, the full moon rose over us, which is the still popular oldest Islamic nasheed or vernacular vocal hymn in the Muslim world. That hymnotic lineage of that nasheed is recognized in the Caribbean, with Muslims sometimes referring to it as the first qasida. By contrast, Caribbean Muslims do not cite the antecedents of anything else, any of the older classical formal Arabic qasida forms, none of the mantle odes. What's very interesting to me is that although mainstream Caribbean Muslims and organizations are quite willing to embrace most aspects of contemporary Saudi and UAE proselytization and transnational Egyptian revivalist education on proper, unauthentic Islam and dress, in particular hijab for women, the majority will not budge on this qasida issue. They will not give it up. It's probably more than they're just Caribbean, and that in Trinidad and Jamaica in particular, music is so important that it informs national politics rather than the other way around. While Caribbean Muslims have Islamic arguments ready to go about how Urdu qasidas are good bidah or good innovation, what's most important, as Ustad Nazim Baka says, is that, quote, they want what they know. And I prefer to sing what the people know because our foreparents brought it that way, and that's how we have to do it. I'm just quoting him. They bring it in the Urdu. If people are going to sing in Arabic, how are we going to understand? They have to get somebody singing in Urdu, what he called we language. That is to say, Caribbean Muslims want to hear the nostalgic old-time Urdu qasidas of their ancestors because it reminds them, who are displaced descendants of indentured laborers, that they come from somewhere and from a particular Persianate Indian Islamic tradition that is not an Arab one, even though they now embrace Gulf and North African Arab authority in other religious matters. I wanted to show you.
But they don't understand the Urdu words. But they hear the ancestors.
If you see it and its presence is there, the performance of that is enough.
Yeah.
So this was the album that I brought, Marsha and Fel. So this is the album that was on the first the first page of the first slide here. So this is a fairly well-known Trinidadian Muslim album from like the late 1970s. Called Muslim Inspiration. And why this one is interesting is that on the A side, there is a fully constituted Maulud Sharif religious ceremony where the singers go through the entire thing as if you were in person. And then on the B side, it's just Qasidas. And you get like little bios of these guys showing that they're, you know, legitimate and they have some Islamic authenticity going. I pass it around, but the sleeve is really in fragile condition, but the LP is fine. So, you know, it's easy. It's also online if you were interested in listening to it. Indo-Caribbean regional and diasporic Qasida singers record and produce their music transnationally now. In Guyana and New York, there's Ustad Nazim Bakas, and in Trinidad and New York, there's Nasir Khan. Naimun Majid, who is Guyanese and also lives in New York, was the most famed woman singer. She was known as the Queen of Qasida. These popular singers are sometimes accused of popularizing Qasidas for their albums by using filmy Bollywood tunes from Muhammad Rafi, Kishore Kumar, and other mid-century playback Indian singer favorites of Indo-Caribbean aficionados of the Indian film industry. Not the modern guys, the old guys, like Muhammad Rafi. Bollywood secularization seems to be a bridge too far for many for Qasida creolization. I'm going to end relatively soon by just showing you some of the people who are still singing this stuff. Maybe we can get this off of her face. On Eid al-Fitr in 2020, during the early COVID-19 pandemic, I attended a Zoom Eid prayer at the new Grant Masjid, which is in South Trinidad. Also because I have relatives out there who go to this mosque. That is a heavily Indo-Trinidadian region, so it's noteworthy that the masjid has Afro-Trinidadian members too. The online gathering, and there's something to be said about, a longer thing to be said about how people perform religion during COVID-19 on Zoom. The online gathering included local Trinis and their diasporic relatives in Guyana, the US, Canada, and the United Kingdom, a Caribbean reunion. I was treated to hear Sister Farida Muhammad and other ladies and children singing from the Songs of Islam Qasida songbook. The format of this was the same, the format of Eid online and the singing of the Qasida was the same as in person. There was an Eid prayer, then a khutbah sermon by the Imam, and then the function, differently, was turned over to women, who were actively urged to sing Qasidas. The Imam, Muhammad Imtiaz Rashid, encouraged people by saying, "Sing a little song now." Most people knew the songs and followed along in the choruses. Despite the loss of Urdu as a spoken language, even online in these spaces, these Urdu Qasidas remain the sound of the Muslim Caribbean. So let's end with hearing. It's just frozen. No. Great. So let's end with hearing Ustad Nazim Bakas, who is the Guyanese champ and also my old Islamic teacher, my old Quran teacher, sing a Qasida. He lives in New York now, and the last time, about 2 years ago, that I visited him to pay my respects, he was in a singing mood. So I asked him to sing his favorite Qasida. He demurred and he said he had a lot of favorites. His voice is creakier now than in his 80s and 90s heyday, but then he sang this Qasida that I'll play for you, which he said is an especially blessed Qasida because it has 4 choices of airs or melodies. Looking at the synopsis, which you can absorb as we listen, I think that with this choice, the Ustad also wanted to educate me and others about how Qasidas are in fact lawfully Islamic and that it is not an innovation for a Muslim in the Caribbean or anywhere to give durood or salawat, which means salutations and blessings, to the Prophet Muhammad. Islam in the Caribbean, as we have heard, is simply an ongoing creolizing process. All right, so let's listen to him. I have another story about him too, which is that, so this is the first time I saw him in like decades, and he didn't have a beard anymore. Like when I knew him, he had a ginormous beard because he's an Islamic teacher. And he told me that as many immigrants from the Guyanese community do, he works at JFK Airport, and they made him shave his beard off. So even though he's an Islamic teacher, he can't have a beard because he had to work at JFK. It's so messed up. Okay.
Salli
Oh, that's-
ala Muhammad की दवा है सल्ले अला मोहम्मद तावीज़ हर बला है सल्ले अला मोहम्मद हर दर्द की दवा है सल्ले अला मोहम्मद तावीज़ ज़हर बला है सल्ले अला मोहम्मद महबूब किबरिया है सल्ले अला मोहम्मद क्या नक्श कुश नमा है सल्ले अला मोहम्मद कुर्बे खुदा हासिल जन्नत में हो दाखिल जिसने लिखा पढ़ा है सल्ले अला मोहम्मद तावीज़ ज़हर बला है सल्ले अला मोहम्मद जन्नत मकाम होगा दोज़ख हराम होगा गर दिल पे लिख लिया है सल्ले अला मोहम्मद उसकी नजात होगी रहमत भी साथ होगी जो पर के मर गया है सल्ले अला मोहम्मद तावी
Stop there. It continues onward. This is the point in religion in these Caribbean Muslim religious ceremonies. When these guys start, everybody starts crying because they remember their childhood, they remember their mother and father, they remember religion. They're just like everybody's crying. Okay, so I'd love to take any questions that you have. Thank you.
Do you have any personal favorite qasidas?
I really like the one that the one that I was doing the close reading of that you heard Chitra and Jagjit singing. That one, and of course, you know, anything he sings is good because it flashes me back to when I was like 8. And I heard him singing them for the first time. Although what was interesting about him is that he kept this part of his life, like his Qasida singing, separate from, he kept it outside of the mosque. In the mosque, he was like a really strict Quran teacher. And, you know, back in the day, because that's how it was in the colonies, he had a whip. Only the boys used to get beaten. Although I don't know what that means. It's not a good thing either. But yeah, he used to keep it separate. This was outside of the mosque, but also viewed by people as something Muslim. Yeah. Thanks for that question. It's lovely. Yeah, go ahead, Arnav.
So my understanding of the Qasida is that it sort of begins in a weeping at the site of ruins. Is that not
Begin,
always?
sorry.
The first part or the first movement of the Qasida, not in this one, but in the form itself, is weeping at the site of ruins. Is that always the thing, or is it, or like
That's a great question. I mean, like,
that figure into creolization?
yeah, like that echoes the traditional structure, the traditional Arabic ode, but it doesn't follow that exact scheme in like your contemporary qasidas. Like I mentioned, it's condensed. So what it begins with is like the function, like here, like it explains the function of why you are singing this particular qasida and who it's for, you know, which echoes this like the original Arabic panegyric ode, which tells you who the patron is. But in this case, the patron is God. So it's kind of starts like that, and then like it expounds later on, and there's always instructions there on like what somewhere in there about like what Muslims should do in order to praise God and how they should remember certain things. Loose following of the structure, loose. Yeah, Jarian.
Do we typically sung in the mosque? Just because I know you said in the virtual service in Trinidad,
Yeah,
they sing afterwards. And
yeah.
Teacher keep them separate. So is it something that's done outside of the mosque, or is it something that's done?
That's a great question. Outside. Yeah. Because, you know, while you will hear all of the people who practice Qasidas, listen to Qasida and so on, like they have Islamic justifications for why it's okay to listen to music and this music, especially because this is vocal music, which is different from instrumental music. There's no instruments here. It's people just vocalizing. They keep it separate for sure. I mean, in the mosque, most of these guys too, like when it's men, they're also like skilled in recitation of the Quran. So they do that kind of recitation inside the mosque, but they don't mix it with this. This is outside. Yeah, Gar.
Thank you for that wonderful presentation. By the way, growing up, I would never have heard the phrase Allah Hafiz. It would always
It's always for that, right? Of course.
It sounded strange. But in any case, I was just to follow up on the question. Maybe I misunderstood you, but I thought you said that at some point Sunni women used to sing.
They did.
Together
That's
in
right.
mixed gender groups, and now it's just only competitions.
Yeah.
And is this because of the kind of the Arabic?
I would argue yes. No, you didn't mishear at all.
Because some similar stuff is happening in East Africa as well.
Of course. These same sites of the early Indian labor diasporas. Yeah, no, you didn't mishear at all. So like if you were to come around the 1920s or the 1930s, even up into the 40s and 50s, you would hear Sunni women singing in mixed gender religious gatherings, not in mosques, right? But I'm talking about like celebrations of birth, like kids, like children being born that were mixed gender, or even like celebrations of the Prophet's birth, the Milad Sharifs, but that were held in homes, not in the mosque. You would hear them singing it, but they no longer do it. And I think I would suggest yes, it is because of like the influence of like global revivalist movements that's all over the world. And it's pretty strong in Guyana, especially with, and it starts, as I was mentioning, with 1970s non-aligned Dawa diplomacy from Libya, specifically with this guy who was associated with the Gaddafi regime, whose name was Ahmed Ehwas,
Yes.
and later killed by them.
Yeah.
But it starts there in the 70s. And then it just continues, but there are different actors, as I mentioned now, like Qatar and Kuwait are big. They fund, so how they do it is they fund the building of mosques, like humongous mosques.
Happening in East Africa all over the place.
Yeah, and you know, what comes along with the mosques are the books and the people.
Can I ask one other question? I was confused about what you said about the relationship between the ghazal form.
Yes.
Can you elaborate a bit on that?
Yeah. So I had a whole section that I skipped there in the interest of
We grew up listening to ghazals, right?
of getting so the ghazal is a different form. What happens in the Anglophone Caribbean is that they conflate a lot of these forms. Like Qasida is the like umbrella term that has come to symbolize the ghazal. The Naat, the supplication praise song, something called the munajat, which is like directly praising God, and all of those forms are just encompassed under Qasida in the Caribbean. Yeah.
But it had come from Urdu
Yeah.
tradition as a Qasida, not as a ghazal, right?
No, came as a Qasida.
So is that a way to, even from the Urdu tradition, to distinguish between the ghazal as a kind of a love poetry and the Qasida as a religiously oriented
I think you
type
can.
poetry?
I think you can. There is not very much like specific ghazal recitation, his tradition. There's none of that really in Guyana and Trinidad. Not really. When they hear, you know, it's so interesting how these languages function. The performance of these languages functions as an authenticating, you know, something authenticating for people, even when they don't understand what is being said at all. So anytime they hear Urdu, and anytime they hear Arabic, they're like religious. It must be religion, must be religious. So even if they're going to hear ghazals, they don't know what is the meaning.
Yeah.
So they might assume it has some kind of religious content to it. But no, the traditional ghazals that you may know of, they're not performed like that in Caribbean. Yeah, that's great. Any questions? Yes, sir.
This is a sideways question, I guess. What's the difference between a Qasida 2 E's and a Qasida IDA? I know there was a huge collection of North African Qasidas translated into Spanish around 1900, 1908, and it was very instrumental for the early Romantic poetry out of Spain.
Yeah, so it just depends on who's doing the transliteration. I mean, it's supposed to sound like Qasida, right? Where you're stressing the I or the EE. So as long as it's producing the same sound, people transliterate it with either an I. But it's a stretched I.
It's just the Spanish is in Lorca, he uses this.
Lorca uses it, several others. The editor was named Gustavo Gomez, I think. He did about 100 Qasidas out of North Africa that people like Lorca could read in Spanish.
Yeah.
And those may have come from Andalusia itself.
They may have, yeah.
Well, actually, the thing with like when you mentioned the Suad Qasida,
Yeah.
that was almost like the end. See, that poem presented to the Prophet Muhammad was sort of like the cusp between pre-Islamic Qasida and Islamic Qasida. But that the as you were saying, the pre-Islamic Qasida always begins with a farewell to the beloved. Like, see,
Yes, it's always about
Always about
beloved,
that.
and it's often a man speaking to a younger
so
acolyte.
he's going to Muhammad to declare his conversion to Islam, but he begins the performance. But my girlfriend is gone. So that because that's where it always the poem is always begins from there. After a few decades, especially with the dynasties, the poem begins, the three-part poem begins to break into other parts, and you begin to have the more of the patron-like poem where, you know, the court wants wit and it wants praise. And so essentially the long poem that used to be like almost like a lyric epic, like the original Qasidas were almost 100 lines.
Right.
And nobody really wanted to sort of, the individualism of the original kind of epic lyric began to be broken into different kinds of poems. And then you have the very, there was a whole competition between poets condemning each other. And then there are poets that are like praising the caliph. And then you have this, the love poem becoming separate. So you had broken up into, you had one big Qasida, the suspended odes, and then it began to split into different parts. But all of them are now called Qasida. And even when there was a poetry that was no longer rhymed, it's now called Qasidat al-Nathar, which means what they call it as a prose Qasida, even though it's not, it's broken into lines. So anything that have to do with poetry is Qasida when it's a finished piece. It's just
Yeah, and then
kind of
so
bring it.
this arrives from the Caribbean by way of like Nawabi Lucknow, which arrived there by way of like Persia, which then arrived there by way of the Arab world.
Yeah.
And now it's a thing in the Caribbean.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. And I love how they just said that we're gonna have to keep this because it has a certain kind of meaning and connection to origins.
Yes,
Yeah.
it's our ancestral art form.
Yeah.
Yeah, or literary form, literary and musical form. Yeah, sure.
Question, just because I wasn't here for this part. Where's this photo from?
Sorry.
Where's this photo from?
This particular one?
Yes.
Oh, it's on the bottom here. So it's in Berlin, Museum of Berlin.
It's from Iran originally.
Yeah, originally from Iran.
That's the one from Ka'b ibn Zuhair.
Yeah.
And that's the poem where he came oh prophet, I'm going to, declare convert. But he begins with that poem of parting of the beloved, and then the poem begins to take up the other issues later on. So yeah, it's a beautiful poem.
Yeah. As I was saying, I just really like it because I have friends named Suad. So, I like every so often I'll be like, so Suad has departed. Yeah, girl.
The Hosei,
Yeah.
and the immersion of the tombs in the water. Is that a uniquely Caribbean thing, or that's
No.
also in India? Or?
Yeah. So you can really directly trace this back to Nawabi Lucknow. Where it comes from this tradition in Lucknow of these these like enclosures called imambaras, where people would like for over a year build these very elaborate taja tombs, and then yes, they do take them to a body of water. So that is not new.
Because the reason I ask is it reminded me so much of the Hindu ceremony
Yeah,
of the Ganesh.
that's what the
Ganesh,
Muslims are saying in
Yeah, yeah.
Trinidad. That is too Hindu. Yeah.
The Ganesh, you take the
Yeah,
Ganesh.
that's exactly what they're saying.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, no, that's exactly what they're saying. But yes, in India, they were and still are taking it to a body of water and immersing. I mean, interesting in Trinidad now is that the government now the government has environmental regulations. And the skeleton of these structures is styrofoam. So, which you then decorate with all kinds of tinsel and so on. So what they do is like they take it out into the ocean and or into the Gulf of Paria, and then they dunk it, right? Like so maybe 20 or 30 men. Yeah, it kind of looks like that, to be completely honest. Although it's like the most otherworldly scene you've ever seen in your life. Like if you can go to that type of thing, go, because you'll have at the same time as this is happening, the beating of these massive tassa drums. And it will happen at dusk and on these like darkened beaches and the beating of these drums. And you're like, where am I? Like, what century is this? That this is.
Do they have to bring it back because of the?
Yeah.
Okay.
So what they do, like 20 or 30 men will take it into the water. They'll pull it under so that it dunks. Oh wait, here.
Yeah.
They'll pull it under so that it dunks, and then they'll kind of let it float for a little bit. And then eventually they'll, maybe after, 10, 15 minutes or so, they have to bring it back in. But what ends up happening is that it starts breaking up in the water. Like all these pieces start coming off, but they have to make sure they bring in all the pieces. Otherwise the government of Trinidad will fine them for polluting the water.
So, okay, the word molid or milad, this is also a word that's connected to the main associations with the birth of the prophet. But in folk Islam in Egypt, there is like monthly molids that are festivals that are associated with saints.
Yeah.
And in them, I don't know how much ceremonies or spectacle, but there's a lot of singing, a lot of but that's really folk Islam, and it is gender mixed. So like men and women are there together. So it's almost like the more folk Islam is much more open to gender, much more open to music, and it's not associated with. I have a friend who specializes in folk Islam in Egypt, and he said, I'm going to go to this Molid. Now it's going to be in this other part of Egypt, the other part of Egypt, and so in what way there might be echoes of that with the word Molid that you're speaking of, or as folk Islam in general?
So essentially, the exact use of Milad in the Caribbean, the word tends to just accrue to celebrations of the birth of the prophet, right? Rather than like big celebrations that are kind of general things that are quasi-religious, quasi-folkloric. So but what's happened is that these Malids, maybe with global influence, have grown in size to maybe resemble some more of the ones that you're
They've grown. The Molid has grown
in size
at the expense of the Hosei.
It happens at completely different times and places.
Later.
The Hosei has only survived because of like British cracking down on it and because the Muslims frown on it as kind of Hindu or whatever. So the Hosei has only survived in a procession in St. James, Port of Spain, the capital. A procession that happens in South Trinidad and a procession that happens in Clarendon in Jamaica. It no longer exists in Guyana as a thing at all. And they are at specific times of the year. They're on 10 Muharram. But it's not that people haven't been prepping for like the whole year. But that's limited to 10 Muharram. One day, or rather 3 days, because just like they did in India, for these Imambara massive yards, they will crack the door open 3 days before Ashura, right? Like 10 Muharram, and then like you will first get a glimpse. The crowd will gather. I've done this. It's really cool. Like the crowd will gather to first get a glimpse of the big taja that's being built. And sometimes they build little miniature tajas that they will then take in a procession down the road on like the 3rd day before Ashura. Yeah, and then there's also this custom of these moons. You see, these are not tombs at all, but these moons, the red one represents Hussein and the green one represents Hassan.
No, one more question about the Molid. Molid is okay in the Sunni sort of realm in the Caribbean, right? Is considered okay?
Man, like, it depends.
Okay.
If you are a member of a Muslim congregation that more closely follows these like Indo-Muslim practices and so on, then you're fine. But then a lot of people have been very influenced by Islamic revivalism, like, and people coming from abroad telling them they're doing things wrong and they're doing things un-Islamically. So now, don't know, it depends on the mosque.
Yeah, because in the Sunni world where I come from, there are like particular foods that are served in the Prophet's birthday. There are the Sufis go out and sing the praises of the Prophet, and so there's essentially any kind of folk traditions and ceremonies, festivals or parade-like things are really something that the conservative Sunnis don't like. Because you can have like a ceremony is like you get an official and an imam, everything is tight and it's all tied to power. But anything that allows for dispersal of power or sort of folk customs and so on, then they
same exact thing.
They want to ban it.
Things are generally moving in the direction of attempting to stamp out these folk customs.
Yeah, so like in Libya, you have the Mufti saying, "Don't celebrate that, don't do," and don't do this food thing. And then the next day on Facebook, everybody's making a different thing of that same dish. Here's what I made, and it's all other like on Molid in my Facebook page. It's like 10,000 versions of this one sweet dish that people are making as a way of fighting the Mufti. So
it's a wonderful depiction of all of this in Amitabh Ghosh's in an antique land, and stuff.
Yeah. There's specific sweetmeats associated with, like dessert type sweetmeats that are Indian that are associated with these kinds of ceremonies in which Qasidas are sung. Like your usual semolina pudding, like which you have to make sure to call sirni, which is what the Muslims use, as opposed to like the exact same thing made of semolina flour, which Hindus call farsad or mohanbol.
The naming makes a difference.
Yeah.
All right. Well, if any more questions or
this is just to solve my confusion. When I was a boy in the Caribbean, and I thought Jose was Virgin Islands.
Okay, cool.
So I thought that Jose was the biggest festival in Port of Spain, not something that had disappeared. And that it was actually sponsored by the government and was very secular and tourist driven and stuff like that.
Yeah, so I mean, it occurs at a different time of the year from Carnival. For a while there, people were arguing that the celebration in Port of Spain specifically had become carnivalized.
Yes.
The like taking it back for Islam started happening in the late 90s.
And all the Calypso road shows were carnivalized as in name of Jose.
They did, like, starting in the Lizard question in the late 1990s, they started trying to split them and like purging this festival of what people viewed as carnivalesque elements. In particular, now along the parade route, they ban consumption of alcohol and like you're policed like how people dress and stuff. That's policed. So just to separate it,
Okay.
and kind of re-Islamize it.
But the African version of those raps always is in favor of agua and contains glasses of rum on the raps.
Yeah, no, you're not gonna see that. Yeah,
I know Walcott, I think, there's a mention of Jose somewhere.
he does, his Nobel Prize speech.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Who does?
Derek
Derek
Walcott,
Walcott.
Derek Walcott mentions Ramlila first, and then he mentions Hussein. Yeah.
That might be my source. I knew him back in those days.
Oh, wow, let's interview you.
To the Virgin Islands to put on some of his plays at a local church, so I was in my early 30s. I could help out with that.
Yeah.
You know.
That's awesome.
Well, if we have no more questions, thank you all for
Thanks for
coming,
coming.
and thank you.